Something that I mentioned to people is like, sometimes an illustrator never even talks to the author whose work they're illustrating. That blows my mind. I'm like, what? Like, how is that the thing? How is that the way that it works?
Hello and welcome to Art Restart, where we explore how artists are reinventing their fields and building a new landscape for the arts. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, the producer and editor of this podcast, a production of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts at the University of North Carolina School of the Arts. In this episode, we'll be hearing from cartoonist and illustrator Zeke Peña. Though he currently lives in Fayetteville, Arkansas, for most of his professional life, Zeke has focused on the people, ecology, and politics of El Paso, Texas, where he grew up and lived for decades. A self-taught artist with an undergraduate degree in art history from UT Austin, he has built a rich portfolio of varied works that, as he describes them, are a mashup of political cartoons, border rasquache, and hip-hop culture. He has illustrated several award-winning books, including My Papi Drives a Motorcycle, which the New York Times called the best children's book of 2019, and Photographic, The Life of Graciela Iturbide, a Boston Globe Horn Book Nonfiction Award Winner, and a Moonbeam Children's Book Gold Award Winner. Both were written by Isabel Quintero, who has become a close collaborator. In 2023, he illustrated best-selling author Jason Reynolds' Miles Morales Suspended, a Spider-Man novel. Zeke's editorial work has appeared in a wide array of publications, including Vice, ProPublica, and Latino USA. I knew that Zeke had started off his career painting large-scale oil paintings before he fully committed to cartooning and illustration, so I started off our conversation by asking him why he switched from one genre to the other.
Because the story was the most important thing, painting a 4-foot oil painting is not the most efficient way of telling a story. And that was probably the main reason, was the efficiency, right? It's like you can take 2 weeks to 2 months to paint an oil painting to tell one story, or you can draw it in a more simplified cartoon style and have the same impact and tell the same stories. And I at some point I also realized that I felt obligated to paint that way. I felt obligated to paint realistically. It's what I was always taught that art was. It's what I studied in school. I mean, I had a few professors that were into like the graphic arts, which is what I always gravitated towards: printmaking, Xicano, printmaking, and all of that stuff. And so
Right, that long tradition,
right? But it was always the things that you go to see in museums are the oil paintings. You see all of the master oil painters, and so I realized that I was painting out of obligation. I was painting this way out of obligation, not to mention that it was more expensive. It took more time. It takes a lot more space to store that work and ship that work and all of those things. Also, it's using really toxic materials. I mean, there was just a lot of reasons why I was like, oh, this is probably not the best for the work that I'm trying to do. And so, so I just made the jump, and I never really looked back, and I feel so much more comfortable making the work that I'm making now. I just feel like it's coming from an honest place. Yeah.
Now I'd love to talk about the River Project. When did the idea for the whole project start cementing in your brain, and how's it been growing through the years?
Yeah, I'm going to try to be as concise as possible. It's sometimes difficult for me to discuss this project because there were so many iterations, and it was such dense and connected work. So one thing connected to the next thing, connected to the next thing. But I had always been focused on my region. Certainly the border is a theme in my work, or a topic of research in my work.
The region being specifically El Paso and...
the Paso del Norte is what it's called today, right? Which is the region that El Paso, Ciudad Juárez, and the Isleta del Sur Pueblo, which is an indigenous sovereign pueblo there. That's the region that I'm talking about. But, you can't miss it. It's a big part of our lives growing up there. depending on which side of the border you grew up on, I should be clear that I grew up in the United States. I'm not an immigrant. I'm second generation on my dad's side. And then my mother's family is from southern New Mexico, where they've been living for many generations. And so that being a part of like my personal life, I think is why I gravitated towards the story. But I think what cemented the story was focusing on the issue of human rights and border crossings at the time. So this is many years ago. I think in like 2012 or in 2013 was when I started to look at kind of what was going on. It was not getting a whole lot of media coverage at the time. I mean, it's so prevalent now and so covered now, right? I think sometimes to a fault. Yeah, so at that time I was focused on that and just started having discussions. I got a grant from the Museum and Cultural Affairs Department in the city of El Paso, Texas. And so from getting that grant, I collaborated with friends of mine, a group of friends, Claudia Ley, Sandra Iturbe, Carolina Franco. Like there's several friends that were my partner that were aiding in this work and helping this work along its way. And just started having discussions with people talking about their experience with the border and with the river. And the first iteration of that work was titled Waterbound. And I made a series of paintings, and there was audio interviews that we performed and video interviews that we took to get people's oral histories about the water. And I think that was really where it started. I mean, after you start asking people about the river, it's such a fruitful topic of discussion because it generates a lot of emotion in people. And I think what really started the river work was that in those discussions with people, in those oral histories, there was a really clear generational shift that happened from one generation to the next with regard to the relationship of the river. Yeah, we were speaking with elders in our community, and those elders had these really significant, beautiful stories about going to the river and fishing in the river and swimming in the river and sitting by the river and having parties and things like that. And then, one or two generations later, which is my generation, and we have no relationship with the river. And the river, if I'm being honest, was always just the border to me, right? Like it was always talked about and discussed as just being the border.
And
So
inaccessible, right? In a way that it wasn't physically inaccessible, in a way it wasn't for older generations.
exactly, right? There's this cognitive dissonance also, in addition to that physical distance that's created as a boundary. And also how that's, the border is a unilateral thing, right? The border is owned by the United States. Mexico doesn't put up walls and things like that, right? So people that live on the side of Ciudad Juarez, they can still walk up to the river. And I mean, it's prohibited now because people get shot and things like that. It's very militarized. And so I think, that generational shift was really what was the spark for that story, right? And trying to understand it for myself. I mean, it's not anything more than me just trying to understand personally, why is it that I think about the river this way? And why is it that I didn't have a better relationship with the river that has sustained my family for generations? So that's really what the work is looking at. And then talking with other folks from different areas and different regions and hearing more about what they have to say about it.
What have you yourself discovered through your art in the process of this project making?
For me personally, it's uncovered a lot of my family's history, right? Like in going into archives and things like that, learning about where my family comes from, because the border has severed a lot of my familial history. On my dad's side, I can't even go one generation. I can't go past my grandparents, I don't know where my great grandparents were from before I started working on this project. And then after researching, it's like, oh, like there it is. Like they come from a completely different place than I thought they did.
Had your father himself not known that history?
Not even. I mean, I have some audio recordings. These are not from this project, but I'm a historian, right? So I was always going to my grandparents and recording them and asking them questions and documenting. And I have some cassette tapes of my grandfather talking with me and my dad. And I told my dad, I said, I wanted to go talk to my grandpa and I want to ask him about where we come from and where he's from. And he shared with us stories that my dad had never heard. And you hear in the cassette tape how more and more the questions start coming from my dad as opposed to coming from me, because my dad, he just grew up in a household where they didn't talk about that kind of stuff, where they don't share that kind of stuff. And so,
Which is
there.
also, it's kind of an immigrant reaction too. You want your kids, I guess, to assimilate also,
Absolute, like,
right?
oh my
Yeah.
goodness, absolutely, yeah. On both sides of my family, that's the case. So I think that what we do with the intent of assimilating is we sever ties to where we're from, right? We sever the roots of where we're from. So I think that that's what I'm trying to mend. I'm trying to heal from that, if I'm being honest.
Did you illustrate that moment of your dad asking more questions than you?
I haven't yet. I've made work about my dad and I've made work about my grandpa. I think that story will come eventually. It was
How have they seen the work, and how have they reacted to it?
they haven't. I'd never had the pleasure of my grandfather really seeing my
Oh,
work. He passed away, and then my dad also passed away suddenly about 13 years ago. So
oh.
he saw some of my work, but I don't think he ever saw like these projects that I'm working on, at least not in this realm, right? I like to think that he's witnessing it from a different perspective, but
Well, how lucky that you were able to witness him asking those questions for your sake
it
and for
it
his.
is, yes, it's such a special, that was such a special moment, right? Was
Mm.
knowing that he also wanted to know, but just never had the time or maybe the courage to ask, right? And I was happy to be that little connection. And I think that that's the motivation for this work, is just trying to help us reconnect, right? Just trying to help people reconnect to their history. And that's been through the river. When you start asking people about the river, they really start reconnecting, because water is memory, right? Like the river remembers what we've been through, and the river remembers what the area has been through. And so when we start turning our attention to that, the memories come, they flow. I guess I should have used that. It was right there and I could have had that, but no.
Do you have a plan to publish an accumulation of the River Project, or what's your overall goal for it?
Yeah, that project's been on pause for a little while. I think that I've taken a step back from documenting people's oral histories. I've really turned to my own family's history, because I think it's what I have the most license and agency, and I have the right to tell that story. I started to question a little bit the gathering, because that a lot of that work can be really extractive, right? That oral history work, it can be extractive. So I'm trying to rethink that process and how best to move forward with it. But I do know that from a personal standpoint, I do have intentions of publishing the stories that relate directly to my family and to the river, because yeah, I literally like learned my family's history by looking at the river. Like researching the river is what helped me understand where my mom's family comes from in that region, and where my dad's family comes from.
In my eyes, you're kind of writing in the genre that is, in a way, the most dangerous. You're making illustrations, which throughout the decades, whenever there's a moral panic in this country, is kind of the first thing that people target, that the moralists target, because children like illustrations. And we're seeing it happening with book bans concerning books, especially illustrated books that deal with, in any way, about race, the border, LGBT issues and all that. So, what's it like for you to make your work in this particular social and political climate?
Yeah, I don't think that I have the objectivity to quite reflect or say something poignant or enlightening on it, because we're witnessing it right now. So I can only reflect on how
How it's
it's
feeling?
changed. Yeah, how it's feeling exactly. How is it feeling now, and how I think I have to ask the question is, has it changed the way that I've told any story, or has it changed whether or not I tell a story? I can honestly say that it probably has. I think that I have shied away from things for fear of my safety and my family's safety. I've maybe tried to be more creative in the way that I'm delivering certain things.
Can you give me an example?
For example, I don't use a whole lot of words in my work anymore. I'm telling story through images. People either understand the visual language or they don't understand it, right? Like I make work for the people who are closest to me in my community, and first and foremost, that's who I make work for because that's the voice that I know how to speak in best. And then I hope that other folks can engage with it and read it and understand it and take away something from it. But I can't say that I write with the intention of everyone understanding my work because that's just not going to happen. It's not possible, right? You're always going to exclude someone. Everyone's always going to exclude someone by telling a story. And so I do my best to be inclusive and I do my best to be extremely accessible by using simplified images and simplified iconography. But I think that that's one way it's changed it, I would say.
I love to talk about how artists reinvent outmoded systems in their fields, especially since the pandemic. So I'm wondering if there's anything in your field, whether in how you make work or how you get it out to as many eyes as possible, if there's any system that you think could be reinvented or be made to work much better than it currently is.
Ooh. Um, I think the two that popped up for me, the first one, because I do a lot of work in publishing, I certainly think that access to publishers is an issue, especially for storytellers that may or may not have the training, representation, knowledge, or to access
How did you make
publishing.
your connections?
I mean, it was through the back door, definitely. I always say that I got into publishing through the back door. It was on a whim. I mean, I had always wanted to make comics. I had always wanted to make books from a young age. And the work that I was making, especially the illustrated and cartooned work, the comic work, was always made with that intention of eventually being able to publish. But I just had no. I mean, I was that person, right? Like I had no knowledge of how you do that. Like who do you talk to? Who do you email? How do you even do that? How is it made? Like I didn't know anything about the process. And I think that we could be doing more, even just like on a high school level of like giving young people the knowledge or just like courses or experiences or workshops or things like that so that they understand that if they feel like they have an important story to tell, that they know how to publish it. I mean, fortunately, I think technology and access to the internet and self-publishing is really changing the way that publishing is working, right? Like people who are self-publishing are then going on to make deals to be republished, right?
Oh, I didn't know that.
Yeah, I mean that part's kind of changing. There's like it's not an ideal situation for a publisher to republish work, but I think they do a calculation on like how spread was the publishing and so I think that access, the pathway to accessing publishing, I think is opening more, but I think there's certainly an issue with like creative directors and art directors and who they're reaching out to from like an illustration standpoint. Yeah, it's just tough. So I think that system, I think, is publishing is very outmoded. It's very archaic in the way that it works.
Still now, that's amazing.
Still now, yeah, I think that there's a more collaborative way that you can make books that is sometimes happening with certain publishers. Certainly don't think it's always happening. Like it kind of was something that I mentioned to people is like sometimes an illustrator never even talks to the author whose work they're illustrating. That blows my mind. I'm like, what? Like how is that the thing? How is that the way that it works? I mean,
And surely the author doesn't enjoy that either. It's just the
oh
publisher trying to run interference just to keep things
yeah.
simple.
I mean, I think it's like a simplification thing. It's probably an efficiency thing. I'm sure there's like, they've done their calculations. A lot of it has to do with control. Let's be honest. They can control the narrative and control the story, which I think is fine. But I mean, if our intention is for people to get their honest, genuine story out there in the world, that maybe isn't the best way to go about it. It's with transparency and accountability, right? Like, how can we be transparent about this process and accountable and collaborative? So I think that's certainly something that's outmoded. And then on the, on the fine art front, it's like certainly, access to museums and galleries, institutions, history museums and things like that is letting the community have a voice for what is represented in the space and letting the community inform the spaces that in a lot of places they're paying for with taxpayer dollars. I mean, our experience in El Paso is such that there's such a gap between the community and some of the institutions there with the art museums and the history museums. Certainly that's changing now. Fortunately, a lot of that is changing. But I think that to go to a point that I was talking about before, like I'm certainly not the only one that's trying to reconnect to where I'm from and reconnect to my history.
Mm-hmm.
Can you imagine if we had these more open spaces and accessible spaces that serve the people that are paying for the space with showcasing inclusive stories and for many communities and stuff? Like, I mean, just how transformative that could be. So I think that the access to that space is something that's, I think, of value. You know, where do we gather as a public and as a community in space anymore? That's not centered around sports. That's not centered around going to watch a movie. That's literally like
Or
generative.
staring at a screen.
Or staring at a screen. It's like, where do we go to gather in those spaces? There aren't many of them, and I think that museums, even I'll include theaters in this. Like these spaces could be, perfect for that kind of gathering and balancing out both things. Like so I think that that's something that I think could change and that is certainly outmoded. The hierarchical structures of institutional administration, I think, are outmoded, and I think could certainly benefit from creating some bridges to the communities that they serve and that they exist in, and that they're in a lot of cases being paid for by. Yeah.
I want to talk about, because you mentioned that oftentimes illustrators and authors are not permitted to speak to each other. I read and loved My Papi Has a Motorcycle, and Isabel in her foreword talks about how grateful she is for the work and research you did to bring her vision to life. So could you talk about your conversations with her in creating the book?
Yes. So she is right to point out that we even talked,
Right.
and both her and I were relatively unexperienced in publishing. Neither of us had any previous experience, and we have this long history in coming into publishing at the same time that I won't get all the way into. But we first worked with each other on her first book, Gabby, A Girl in Pieces. And because it was an independent publisher, they let us talk to each other. We texted, we shared ideas. Isabel sent sketches for like certain things that are in her first book. And I recreated some of them. And so it was super collaborative and super open. And I'm so grateful that we had that experience. And it could have only happened at an independent publisher, right? Because they're more open and they're more collaborative and it's less hierarchical and it's all these things. And I think that experience carried over into My Papi Has a Motorcycle, where we went into that book deal as a team. It was like, I'm the illustrator, she's the author. That's somewhat of that's somewhat of a rare thing. Typically an author is submitting a story and then the publisher buys the story and then goes and finds the illustrator. But we were a unique package deal, and I think that the book was better for it.
And then for your own art making, your own self-generated work, is there a big picture project that you've got an eye on completing in the next few years?
Yes, I'm working on a book right now that I'm writing and illustrating. It'll be my first venture into being both an author and an illustrator.
Wow.
So that's definitely the one it's on my table right now. Like it's what I'm sketching on right now. I'm developing the characters. have a pretty solid draft of the story and the manuscript, and so that's what I'm excited about that. Yeah.
Can you tell more about it or not yet?
I can tell a little bit more about it. It has not been announced yet.
So there's a publisher.
There is a publisher, yes.
All right.
And what I can share is that it's a story of a brother and a sister that wake up one morning and watch something fall from the sky into the desert behind their house. And they go on a journey in the desert to go find it.
Oh,
yeah.
Oh, that sounds amazing. Congratulations. I can't wait to read it.
Yeah, thank you so much.
To read a longer written version of this interview and see some of Zeke's most recent work, please head to uncsa.edu/artrestart. You'll get to see samples of a fantastic futurist border series he's been creating. I love this work. If you enjoyed this episode, won't you please share it with your friends? Art Restart is on all the podcast platforms. Our theme music is by Shanghai Restoration Project. I'm Piercarlo Talenti, and on behalf of the Thomas S. Keenan Institute for the Arts, thank you for listening.